The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Kensington Palace as Catherine stood before her wardrobe, her fingers trailing across the carefully arranged garments. Today was different. Today carried weight that pressed against her chest like a stone. The charity gala for children's mental health awareness wasn't just another royal engagement, it was personal, deeply personal, in ways the public would never fully understand. She pulled out the vintage Bennett dress, a piece she had discovered months ago during a private shopping trip. The deep navy fabric felt like silk between her fingers, and the cut was elegant yet understated, exactly what she needed for tonight. As she held it up to the light, memories flooded back to her own childhood, to moments when she had felt lost and alone, wondering if anyone truly understood the weight of expectations that seemed to grow heavier each year. Catherine's relationship with mental health advocacy hadn't begun with royal duty. It had started in university, during those quiet moments when she watched her friends struggle with anxiety and depression, feeling helpless to do more than listen. She remembered late nights in her dormitory, holding Sarah's hand as her roommate cried about the pressure to be perfect, to meet everyone's expectations. Those moments had planted seeds that would eventually grow into her passionate commitment to mental health causes. The dress fit perfectly, hugging her figure in all the right places while maintaining the dignity expected of her position. As she stood before the mirror, Catherine saw not just the Duchess of Cambridge, but the young woman who had once questioned her own worth, who had battled self-doubt, who had learned that strength often came from vulnerability. William appeared in the doorway, already dressed in his formal attire. His eyes met hers in the mirror, and she saw the understanding there, the shared knowledge of tonight's significance. They had talked for hours about this event, about the importance of destigmatizing mental health conversations, about using their platform to reach people who might be suffering in silence. "You look beautiful," he said softly, but his words carried more than surface appreciation. They carried recognition of her courage, her willingness to be open about topics that many in their position would avoid. Catherine turned to face him, adjusting his tie with practiced ease. "Are you ready for tonight?" she asked, though she knew the question carried deeper meaning. Tonight, they would both be sharing personal stories, opening windows into their own struggles and growth. "With you, always," William replied, taking her hand. His thumb traced over her wedding ring, a gesture that had become their silent signal of support over the years. The car ride to the venue was quiet, both lost in their own thoughts. Catherine watched London pass by through the tinted windows, thinking about all the people in those buildings who might be struggling, who might feel alone in their battles with mental health. She thought about her own children, about the world they were growing up in, about the pressures and challenges they would face. The charity gala was being held at a converted warehouse in East London, transformed into an elegant venue while maintaining its industrial charm. As their car approached, Catherine could see the gathering crowd of photographers and reporters. The familiar flutter of nerves danced in her stomach, not from the cameras, but from the weight of the message she hoped to convey tonight. They stepped out together, and immediately Catherine felt the energy shift around them. Cameras flashed, voices called out questions, but she remained focused on William's steadying presence beside her. The vintage dress moved beautifully with each step, the fabric catching the lights in a way that made her feel both elegant and authentic. Inside the venue, the atmosphere was warm and welcoming. Unlike many formal royal events, this gathering felt intimate, purposeful. Catherine recognized many faces: mental health advocates, young people who had overcome significant challenges, families who had lost loved ones to suicide, professionals who dedicated their lives to helping others heal. As they were introduced to various guests, Catherine found herself truly listening to each story shared with her. Maria, a teenager who had struggled with severe anxiety, spoke about how therapy had changed her life. David, a father who had lost his son to depression, talked about his mission to help other families recognize warning signs. Dr. Ahmed shared research about innovative treatment approaches for young people. Each conversation reinforced Catherine's belief in the importance of tonight's message. She felt the vintage dress like a second skin, confident and comfortable, allowing her to be fully present for each interaction. The evening was young, but already she could feel the power of shared vulnerability beginning to work its magic in the room. When the formal program began, Catherine and William took their seats at the head table. The room quieted as the evening's host, a well-known television presenter who had openly discussed his own mental health journey, took the stage. His words about the importance of breaking silence around mental health set the tone for everything that would follow. Catherine's speech was scheduled for later in the evening, but, as she sat listening to the opening remarks, she felt a familiar mix of nervousness and determination. The words she had prepared weren't just talking points, they were pieces of her heart, experiences she had lived, lessons she had learned through her own journey and through supporting others. The vintage dress felt like armor and vulnerability combined, protecting her while also reminding her to remain open and authentic. She thought about the young woman she had been, uncertain and searching, and the woman she had become through years of growth, challenge, and discovery. William's hand found hers under the table, their fingers intertwining in a gesture of mutual support. They had walked this path together, supporting each other through public scrutiny, personal growth, and the constant balancing act of duty and authenticity. As the evening progressed, Catherine felt increasingly connected to the mission at hand. The stories she heard, the courage she witnessed, the hope she saw in young faces, all of it reinforced her commitment to using her platform for meaningful change. The dress continued to draw subtle attention throughout the evening, its vintage elegance sparking conversations about sustainable fashion and the power of choosing pieces with history and meaning. Catherine found herself discussing not just mental health advocacy, but also the importance of making thoughtful choices in all aspects of life. During the dinner portion of the evening, she sat between a young activist named Jamie and an experienced therapist named Dr. Sarah Collins. Their conversation ranged from policy implications to personal strategies for maintaining mental wellness in high-pressure environments. Catherine shared her own techniques for managing stress and staying grounded, morning meditation, connecting with nature, the importance of honest friendships. Jamie, barely 21, spoke passionately about her generation's openness to discussing mental health, contrasting it with the silence that had surrounded these topics in previous decades. Her energy and optimism were infectious, reminding Catherine why this work mattered so much. Dr. Collins, meanwhile, provided the clinical perspective that grounded their conversation in research and evidence-based practices. She spoke about the dramatic improvements in treatment options available to young people, while also acknowledging the work still to be done in making these resources accessible to everyone who needed them. As dinner concluded and the formal speeches approached, Catherine felt a growing sense of anticipation. The energy in the room was palpable, a mixture of hope, determination, and shared commitment to change. The vintage dress had become a conversation starter, leading to discussions about authenticity, sustainability, and the power of making choices that reflected personal values. Looking around the room, Catherine saw faces illuminated not just by the soft lighting, but by genuine engagement with the evening's mission. Young people who had found their voices through overcoming adversity. Parents who had turned their pain into purpose. Professionals who saw their work not just as careers but as callings. The dress, with its timeless elegance and understated beauty, felt like the perfect choice for an evening dedicated to timeless values, compassion, understanding, and the courage to speak truth about difficult topics. Catherine knew that the real work was just beginning, that this evening was just one step in a much longer journey toward creating a world where mental health was treated with the same seriousness and care as physical health. As she prepared for her upcoming speech, Catherine felt grateful for the journey that had brought her to this moment, the struggles that had taught her empathy, the platform that allowed her to amplify important messages, and the partnership with William that made it all feel possible and meaningful. The moment arrived sooner than Catherine had expected. The host's voice carried across the room as he introduced her, and she felt the familiar surge of energy that came before public speaking. Rising from her chair, she smoothed the vintage dress one final time, drawing strength from its classic elegance and the knowledge that she was about to share something deeply meaningful. Walking to the podium, Catherine was acutely aware of every step, every breath. The room had fallen into respectful silence, hundreds of eyes focused on her with expectation and hope. The vintage Bennett dress moved with her like a second skin, its navy fabric catching the stage lights in a way that made her feel both visible and protected. She began her speech with a story from her own teenage years, a moment of vulnerability that she had never shared publicly before. Catherine spoke about a period when the pressure of expectations had felt overwhelming, when she had questioned whether she was strong enough, smart enough, worthy enough for the life that seemed to be unfolding before her. I remember sitting in my childhood bedroom, she said, her voice clear but emotional, staring at university applications and feeling completely lost. Not because I didn't know what to study, but because I didn't know who I was supposed to become. The weight of other people's expectations felt heavier than my own dreams. The audience listened with rapt attention as Catherine continued, sharing how she had learned to distinguish between healthy ambition and destructive perfectionism, between supporting others' expectations and honoring her own authentic self. She talked about the therapy sessions she had attended during university, initially reluctant but ultimately transformative. Seeking help wasn't a sign of weakness, she emphasized, her eyes scanning the young faces in the audience. It was the first truly brave thing I had ever done for myself. It was the beginning of learning that vulnerability is not the opposite of strength, it's the birthplace of courage. As she spoke, Catherine noticed the subtle changes in her audience's posture, the way people leaned forward, the nods of recognition and understanding. Her words were landing exactly where they needed to, creating bridges between her experience and theirs. The vintage dress seemed to embody everything she was trying to communicate: the value of choosing quality over trendiness, authenticity over appearance, substance over surface. She had chosen it not for its designer label but for its story, its craftsmanship, its ability to make her feel genuinely herself. Catherine transitioned into discussing the research she had been studying, the statistics that had driven her to make mental health advocacy a central focus of her work. She spoke about the alarming rates of anxiety and depression among young people, but balanced these sobering facts with stories of hope and recovery. Every statistic represents a real person, she said, someone's daughter or son, someone's friend, someone who matters deeply to the people who love them. When we talk about mental health, we're not discussing abstract concepts, we're talking about human lives, human potential, human dreams that deserve to be nurtured and supported. The speech continued with practical information about resources available to young people struggling with mental health challenges. Catherine had done her homework, researching not just the high-profile organizations but also the grassroots groups, the online communities, the peer support networks that were making real differences in people's lives. She shared contact information for crisis hotlines, described therapeutic approaches that had shown particular promise for adolescents and young adults, and emphasized the importance of finding the right kind of help for each individual's unique situation. There is no one-size-fits-all solution to mental health, Catherine explained. What works for one person might not work for another, and that's okay. The key is not giving up, not believing that you're beyond help, not accepting that struggle is simply your permanent state of being. During this portion of her speech, Catherine noticed William in the audience, his face reflecting pride and admiration. Their partnership in this work had strengthened their relationship in unexpected ways, creating new depths of understanding and shared purpose between them. The vintage dress continued to feel like the perfect choice as Catherine moved into the more personal portions of her speech. She talked about motherhood, about watching her own children navigate the complex social dynamics of their generation, about wanting to create a world where they could speak openly about their feelings without shame or fear. As a mother, she said, her voice taking on new warmth and urgency, I want my children to grow up in a world where asking for help is seen as smart, not weak. Where taking care of your mental health is as normal and important as brushing your teeth or eating vegetables. Where they can be honest about their struggles without worrying that it will define them or limit their opportunities. The audience responded with spontaneous applause, particularly the parents and attendants who recognized their own hopes and fears in Catherine's words. She continued, describing the conversations she had with her children about feelings, about the importance of emotional honesty, about the difference between temporary difficulties and deeper struggles that required professional support. Catherine then shifted focus to the broader societal changes needed to truly address mental health challenges among young people. She spoke about the need for better funding for school counselors, for training teachers to recognize early warning signs, for creating educational environments that prioritized emotional well-being alongside academic achievement. We cannot continue to treat mental health as a luxury or an afterthought, she stated firmly. It must be woven into the fabric of how we care for our young people, from the earliest ages through their transition into adulthood. The vintage dress moved elegantly as Catherine gestured, emphasizing her points with a natural grace that came from genuine passion for the subject matter. She felt completely present, completely authentic, completely committed to the message she was delivering. As her speech progressed, Catherine began incorporating some of the stories she had heard earlier in the evening. With permission from those who had shared their experiences, she wove together a narrative of struggle, seeking help, finding healing, and, ultimately using their experiences to help others. "Tonight, I've met young people who have transformed their pain into purpose," she said. "I've spoken with parents who have channeled their grief into advocacy. I've learned from professionals who see their work not as jobs but as callings. Each of these stories reminds us that healing is possible, that hope is justified, that we can build something better together." The emotional weight of these stories filled the room, but, rather than creating sadness, they generated a sense of collective determination. Catherine could feel the energy shifting, could sense that her audience was moving from passive listening to active engagement with the mission at hand. She concluded the main portion of her speech by returning to personal reflection, sharing how her work in mental health advocacy had changed her own approach to life and relationships. "This work has taught me that true strength lies not in having all the answers, but in being willing to sit with questions," Catherine said. "It's taught me that the most powerful thing we can offer someone who is struggling is not advice or solutions, but simply our presence and our willingness to listen without judgment." The vintage dress seemed to shimmer slightly under the lights as Catherine paused, allowing her words to resonate throughout the room. The silence was profound but not uncomfortable. It was the silence of deep absorption, of minds processing important truths. "I want to leave you tonight with a challenge," Catherine continued, her voice carrying new strength and determination. "I challenge you to be brave enough to check on the people in your life who might be struggling. I challenge you to be honest about your own mental health needs. I challenge you to speak up when you hear language that stigmatizes mental health challenges. And I challenge you to remember that every small act of compassion and understanding contributes to a larger change that our world desperately needs." As she prepared to conclude her speech, Catherine felt overwhelmed with gratitude for the platform that allowed her to share these messages, for the people who had trusted her with their stories, for the opportunity to contribute something meaningful to a cause that had touched her life so profoundly. The vintage dress had been the perfect choice for this evening, embodying the values she wanted to communicate: authenticity, thoughtfulness, the beauty that comes from substance rather than superficiality. As she prepared to leave the podium, Catherine knew that this speech was just one moment in a much larger conversation, but she felt confident that it had been a moment of genuine connection and impact. The applause that followed Catherine's speech was unlike anything she had experienced before. It wasn't the polite, measured applause of formal royal events, but something deeper and more genuine, the kind of response that comes when people feel truly heard and understood. As she stepped away from the podium, Catherine felt the vintage dress move with her like flowing water, its elegant lines perfectly complementing the emotional weight of the moment. William was the first to reach her, his eyes bright with admiration and, something deeper, a recognition of the courage it had taken to share so openly. Without words, he conveyed his pride in her willingness to be vulnerable for the sake of others. Their brief embrace was captured by photographers, but, in that moment, Catherine was aware only of the warmth of his support and the shared understanding of what they were trying to accomplish together. The evening continued with a panel discussion featuring young people who had benefited from mental health services, and Catherine found herself in the audience, listening with the same intensity she hoped others had brought to her speech. The vintage dress allowed her to blend somewhat into the crowd, moving from formal speaker back to engaged participant in the larger conversation. Marcus, a 17-year-old from Manchester, spoke about his battle with social anxiety and how cognitive behavioral therapy had helped him find strategies for managing overwhelming situations. His voice shook slightly as he described the darkest periods of his struggle, but grew stronger as he talked about the support he had found and the future he was now excited to pursue. Catherine found herself deeply moved by Marcus's story, recognizing echoes of her own teenage struggles with self-doubt and social pressure. The differences in their circumstances were obvious. Marcus came from a working-class family and had faced challenges she had never experienced, but the underlying emotions were remarkably similar. Next to speak was Fatima, a young woman whose family's initial resistance to mental health treatment had nearly cost her life. She described the delicate process of helping her parents understand that seeking therapy wasn't a betrayal of their cultural values but an expression of love and care for family well-being. "My therapist helped me understand that honoring my heritage and taking care of my mental health weren't contradictory goals," Fatima explained, her voice clear and confident. "I could be proud of where I came from while also getting the help I needed to thrive in the world I was living in." Catherine made mental notes about the cultural barriers to mental health care that Fatima described, recognizing the need for advocacy efforts to address not just individual resistance to seeking help, but systemic and cultural obstacles that prevented many young people from accessing the support they needed. The third panelist, James, spoke about his experience with depression following his parents' divorce. His story highlighted the connection between major life changes and mental health challenges, emphasizing how temporary circumstances could trigger deeper struggles that required professional attention. "I thought I was just sad about my parents splitting up," James said, "but what I was actually experiencing was clinical depression that needed real treatment. Learning the difference probably saved my life." As Catherine listened to these young people share their experiences with such eloquence and bravery, she felt increasingly convinced that her decision to speak openly about her own struggles had been the right choice. The conversation was shifting from shame and secrecy to openness and support, exactly the kind of change she hoped to encourage. During the break between the panel discussion and the final portion of the evening's program, Catherine moved through the crowd, continuing conversations with attendees. The vintage dress proved to be an unexpected conversation starter, with several people commenting on its classic beauty and asking about its significance. "I chose this dress because it represents something I value deeply," Catherine found herself explaining to a group of young activists. "It's beautiful and well-made, but it's also sustainable and authentic. It feels like the perfect metaphor for what we're trying to achieve tonight, moving away from quick fixes and surface solutions toward approaches that are substantial and lasting." Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a child psychologist from Barcelona who had flown in specifically for the event, approached Catherine during this networking period. "Your speech was extraordinary," she said, "but, more importantly, it was necessary. Young people need to see adults, especially adults in positions of influence, modeling vulnerability and authenticity." Catherine found herself engaged in a fascinating conversation with Dr. Rodriguez about the differences in mental health approaches across different cultures and healthcare systems. They discussed the potential for international collaboration on youth mental health initiatives, the importance of adapting treatments to different cultural contexts, and the role that public figures could play in destigmatizing mental health care globally. "What you're doing here," Dr. Rodriguez continued, "has implications far beyond the UK. When someone with your platform speaks openly about mental health, it creates ripples that reach young people all over the world who might be struggling in silence." The weight of this responsibility settled on Catherine's shoulders, but, rather than feeling overwhelming, it felt motivating. The vintage dress seemed to anchor her in the moment, reminding her that authentic choices, whether in fashion or advocacy, had the power to create meaningful change. As the evening moved toward its conclusion, Catherine was invited to participate in a smaller, more intimate discussion with mental health professionals and advocates. This conversation took place in a side room, away from cameras and formal protocols, allowing for the kind of honest, detailed discussion that could inform future policy and programming decisions. The group included psychiatrists, social workers, school counselors, nonprofit leaders, and young people with lived experience of mental health challenges. Catherine found herself both contributing to and learning from a conversation that was remarkably frank about both the progress that had been made and the work that still needed to be done. "We're seeing more young people seeking help," reported Dr. Michael Chen, who ran a network of youth mental health clinics. "But we're also seeing more severe cases, partly because social media and academic pressure have created new kinds of stress that previous generations didn't face." This led to a discussion about the unique mental health challenges facing young people in the digital age. Catherine shared observations from her own children's experiences, while being careful to protect their privacy. The conversation touched on cyberbullying, social comparison through social media, and the pressure to maintain perfect online personas while struggling privately. "The vintage approach to mental health care," joked Sarah Martinez, a young advocate, "might actually be exactly what we need. Taking time for real relationships, valuing substance over appearance, choosing quality over quantity in how we spend our time and energy." Catherine smiled at the connection Sarah had drawn between her dress choice and mental health philosophy. It wasn't intentional, but it highlighted something important about the values underlying effective mental health care: the importance of authenticity, sustainability, and deep rather than superficial approaches to well-being. The conversation continued to explore practical policy recommendations. The group discussed the need for better mental health education in schools, more accessible therapy options for families with limited financial resources, and improved training for teachers and other adults who work with young people. We need to embed mental health literacy into education the same way we embedded computer literacy over the past 2 decades, suggested Dr. Lisa Thompson, an educational psychologist. Every young person should graduate knowing how to recognize mental health challenges in themselves and others, and knowing how to seek appropriate help. Catherine took careful notes during this portion of the conversation, recognizing potential areas where her advocacy platform could make a real difference. The discussion was giving her concrete ideas for future projects and partnerships. As the formal evening concluded, Catherine felt energized rather than drained. The vintage dress had carried her through hours of emotional engagement while maintaining its elegant appearance, much like the mental health strategies she had learned over the years had helped her navigate challenging situations while maintaining her composure and authenticity. Walking back to the car with William, Catherine reflected on the evening's impact. The story she had heard, the connections she had made, the commitments that had been shared, all of it felt like the beginning of something larger and more significant than a single charity event. That felt different tonight, William observed as they settled into the back seat for the drive home. More personal, more real than usual. Catherine nodded, thinking about the courage it had taken to share her own struggles so publicly, and the response it had generated. "I think people are hungry for authenticity," she replied. "Especially young people. They can tell the difference between talking points and genuine experience." The vintage dress had been wrinkled slightly by the evening's activities, but it still looked elegant and appropriate, much like Catherine felt about herself after hours of emotional openness and advocacy. She had remained true to herself while also serving the larger cause, maintaining dignity while embracing vulnerability. As London passed by outside the car windows, Catherine thought about all the young people in those buildings who might have heard about tonight's event, who might be inspired to seek help or speak up about their own struggles. The ripple effects of authentic advocacy were impossible to measure, but she felt confident that something meaningful had been set in motion. The weeks following the charity gala brought an unexpected flood of responses that confirmed Catherine's sense that something significant had shifted. Letters arrived daily at Kensington Palace, not the usual formal correspondence, but deeply personal messages from young people, parents, and mental health professionals who had been touched by her words that evening. Catherine made it her practice to read many of these letters personally, despite her staff's offers to summarize them. She wanted to understand the full impact of her decision to speak so openly about her own mental health journey. The vintage Bennett dress hung in her closet as a reminder of that pivotal evening, but the real evidence of its significance lay in these handwritten testimonies of lives changed. One letter that particularly moved her came from a 16-year-old named Emma from Scotland. "Your Highness," it began, "I watched the video of your speech online and cried for the first time in months, not sad tears, but relief tears. I thought I was the only person who felt overwhelmed by everyone's expectations. When you talked about sitting in your bedroom feeling lost, I knew exactly what you meant. I showed the video to my mom, and we talked for hours about things I'd never been able to say before. I start therapy next week." Catherine found herself returning to Emma's letter repeatedly, struck by how a moment of vulnerability had created permission for a young person to seek help. She decided to write a personal response, something she rarely did with unsolicited correspondence, explaining how brave Emma was being and encouraging her to continue prioritizing her mental well-being. The professional response was equally encouraging. Dr. Sarah Martinez, the young advocate who had made the connection between vintage approaches and mental health philosophy, had reached out with a proposal for a collaborative research project. She wanted to study how personal storytelling by public figures influenced young people's willingness to seek mental health support. "Your speech created a moment of cultural permission," Dr. Martinez explained during a video call several days after the event. "We're seeing increased calls to mental health helplines, more therapy appointments being booked, and more honest conversations happening in schools and families. The question is how we sustain and build on this momentum." This conversation led to Catherine's involvement in developing what would become known as the Authentic Voices Initiative, a program designed to train public figures, teachers, and community leaders in how to share personal mental health experiences in ways that encouraged help-seeking rather than simply generating sympathy. The vintage dress made another public appearance when Catherine wore it to announce this new initiative at a press conference. Standing once again in its elegant folds, she felt a continuity between that first vulnerable moment and this expanded commitment to systematic change. Sharing our struggles is only the first step, she explained to the assembled journalists. The real work lies in creating systems and cultures that support young people in getting the help they need, when they need it, without shame or barriers. The press response to the Authentic Voices initiative was largely positive, though not without criticism. Some commentators questioned whether Catherine's privileged background made her an appropriate spokesperson for mental health challenges, arguing that her access to resources made her experience incomparable to that of ordinary young people. Catherine absorbed this criticism thoughtfully, recognizing its validity while also understanding that her platform, regardless of how it was acquired, could be used effectively to amplify voices and experiences different from her own. She began incorporating more diverse perspectives into her advocacy work, ensuring that her speeches and appearances highlighted the experiences of young people from various backgrounds. This evolution in her approach led to a series of visits to mental health facilities in underserved communities. Catherine insisted on wearing practical, accessible clothing for these visits rather than designer pieces, recognizing that her fashion choices communicated messages about relatability and understanding. During one such visit to a community mental health center in Birmingham, Catherine met Jamal, a 14-year-old who had been struggling with anxiety following his family's immigration from Somalia. His story highlighted the intersection of cultural transition, economic stress, and adolescent mental health challenges. "Sometimes I feel like I'm living in two different worlds," Jamal explained during a group therapy session that Catherine was invited to observe. "At home, I'm supposed to be grateful and never complain because my parents sacrificed so much to bring us here. At school, I'm supposed to fit in and succeed like everyone else. But, inside, I feel confused and scared most of the time." Catherine found herself deeply moved by Jamal's articulation of experiences she had never faced but could understand emotionally. The pressure to meet conflicting expectations, the isolation of feeling misunderstood, the fear that seeking help might be seen as weakness, these themes resonated across different circumstances and backgrounds. After the group session, Catherine spoke privately with Dr. Amara Hassan, the therapist leading Jamal's treatment. "Working with young people from refugee and immigrant families requires us to understand that mental health exists within complex social and cultural contexts," Dr. Hassan explained. "Jamal's anxiety isn't just individual, it's also a response to systemic challenges his family faces." This conversation opened Catherine's eyes to aspects of youth mental health that she hadn't previously considered in depth. She began studying the connections between social justice and mental well-being, understanding how factors like poverty, discrimination, and cultural displacement affected young people's emotional development. These insights led to the expansion of the Authentic Voices initiative to include training on cultural competency and social determinants of mental health. Catherine worked with experts to develop programming that addressed not just individual mental health challenges, but the broader systems that affected young people's emotional well-being. The vintage Bennett dress made one more significant appearance that year, at an international conference on youth mental health that Catherine helped organize. Representatives from 12 countries gathered to share research, policies, and innovative approaches to supporting young people's emotional well-being. Catherine's keynote address at this conference reflected how much her understanding had deepened since that first vulnerable speech. She spoke about the importance of addressing mental health from multiple angles: individual therapy and support, family and community education, policy changes that address social determinants of health, and cultural shifts that reduce stigma and increased help seeking. Mental health advocacy cannot be separated from broader social justice work, she stated, her voice carrying the confidence that came from months of learning and engagement. "When we work to ensure that all young people have access to quality education, safe housing, freedom from discrimination, and economic opportunities, we are also working to support their mental health." The vintage dress seemed to embody this evolution in Catherine's advocacy, classic and timeless, yet adaptable and relevant to contemporary challenges. Its elegant simplicity allowed the focus to remain on her words and message, while its quality and craftsmanship represented the substantial, long-term approach she had come to believe was necessary for meaningful change. During the conference, Catherine was approached by Dr. Kofi Asante from Ghana, who had been developing community-based mental health programs for young people in West Africa. Your willingness to speak personally about mental health has had an impact far beyond what you might realize, he told her. In Ghana, we're seeing young people reference your speech as they advocate for better mental health resources in their own communities. This global perspective on the impact of her advocacy work filled Catherine with both gratitude and responsibility. The simple decision to share her own struggles honestly had created ripples that reached young people in circumstances vastly different from her own, but who struggled with similar feelings of isolation, pressure, and self-doubt. The conference concluded with the establishment of an international youth mental health network, designed to share resources, research, and advocacy strategies across borders. Catherine committed to serving as a founding patron of this network, understanding that effective mental health advocacy required sustained commitment rather than sporadic attention. Returning home to London, Catherine reflected on the journey that had begun with choosing a vintage dress for a charity event and had evolved into a comprehensive advocacy platform. The dress still hung in her closet, but its significance had grown beyond its role in a single evening. That night, as she helped her children with their homework, Catherine found herself thinking about the world she was trying to create for them and for all young people. She wanted them to grow up in a society where emotional honesty was valued, where seeking help was seen as strength, where every young person had access to the support they needed to thrive. The vintage dress had become a symbol of these values: authenticity over appearance, substance over superficiality, quality over quantity. It represented Catherine's commitment to advocacy that was genuine rather than performative, sustained rather than temporary, meaningful rather than merely fashionable. As she tucked her children into bed, Catherine thought about Emma from Scotland, Jamal from Birmingham, Marcus from Manchester, and all the other young people whose lives had been touched by that evening's conversation about mental health. She thought about the letters that continued to arrive, the therapy appointments being made, the honest conversations happening in families and schools around the world. The vintage Bennett dress had been just a dress, but the moment it had created, the vulnerability it had accompanied, the authenticity it had represented, had become something much larger. It had become part of a movement toward openness, understanding, and systematic change that Catherine was committed to nurturing for years to come. Looking ahead, she felt both humbled by the responsibility and energized by the possibility of continued impact. The dress would return to her closet, but the work it had helped initiate would continue, growing and evolving as more voices joined the conversation about youth mental health and the kind of world they wanted to create together.